hang out and ask. Next up is Lad Keith from our College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape.
Cool. Thank you. Thank everyone. A lot of people in the room know me, but I'm Lad Keith, planning faculty in the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture, and this is a project I'm working on with Ben, so it built on some of his past research and expertise, and then also some of his future CLIMAS projects. And also working with Michael Story, our GRA from Landscape Architecture, who's with us here today. So we actually got started before the funding was official, so thank you for that, Dan. And we have some kind of interesting results already, so I think it's kind of it's an exciting project that I'm glad we're kicking off. So we're looking at evaluating the use of urban heat maps and models in urban planning. And obviously it's a topic of growing concern. So one reason would be the urban heat island effect. A lot of people know about this. It's kind of become popularized in the last decade or so, but it's the idea that when you build dense cities, the concrete and the exhaust and ACs running builds additional heat within the city that raises the temperature outside of what you would see in the surrounding countryside. And actually it's been documented since the 1818 in London. They had some meteorologists looking at it. So we've known about it for a long time, but it's just kind of barely now breaking into planning. And then obviously another reason for concern is temperature increases due to climate change and things like potential extreme heat waves in the future. So there's a lot of documented impacts on communities that specifically go into urban planning. A lot of those relate to heat-related health concerns. And so there's a lot of evidence that shows if you have nighttime temperatures below 80 degrees for a couple of days, it increases vulnerable populations for health risks. It's a huge stressor on urban ecology, so kind of the investments that we make into our plants in the cities. And then it also kind of goes against a lot of climate change mitigation measures that planners are trying to pursue, because when temperatures get hotter, if you have ACs or swamp coolers, you tend to use them more. And the increased energy usage is emitting more greenhouse gas emissions. So kind of a lot of reasons to be concerned about it for planning. And then another reason is it actually goes in direct conflict with a lot of current urban planning goals and practices. So kind of nationwide, but then also specifically for a lot of cities in the Southwest. We're looking at increasing density in cities and doing things like infill development to make more compact cities, again, to help combat greenhouse gas emissions. And we're also making a lot of investments in walkability, bicycling, and transit use. And obviously, if it's hotter outside, you're less likely to walk around, you're less likely to use transit and bicycle. So it's kind of also an economic infrastructure investment concern too. And so there's a lot of current research going on in this area. ASU in particular is doing a lot of great work on urban microclimatology. There's a lot of work going on in improving the urban heat mapping and modeling, and then specifically looking at impacts, things like I mentioned, the public health, urban ecology, and then site treatments. And you can see on the right-hand side, that's in our own downtown Tucson, and that's alleyway that the College of Architecture, Planning, Landscape Architecture helped City High School down there to kind of do some treatments with wind sails, because it wasn't appropriate to have tree plantings, which you hear about a lot for combating heat. So there's a lot of things that we know that work for it. But what I'm specifically looking at is the lack of research on urban heat as a policy focus, and the idea that we know a lot of these good measures, we have a lot of heat maps available, but it's really not breaking its way into day-to-day planning practice. So you don't hear about developments dealing with urban heat unless it's developer driven. And so governments are kind of grappling with how to incorporate this into their day-to-day practices. So some of the theoretical stuff that I'm kind of interested in when I'm looking at this are policy innovations in urban planning. So just super quick, you can have regional diffusion where potentially policies have a geographic or spatial consideration where cities may imitate each other. There might be kind of peer pressure to do things, so they might be competitive. So you see a lot of that up in Phoenix when they adopt policies. And then there's also internal determinants, and a lot of you are familiar with kind of adaptive capacity idea for climate change adaptation. So things like, will cities adopt urban heat policies because they have access to resources like the University of Arizona, or do they have special grant access? They might have strong local leadership or public support for those things. And then of course, windows of opportunity. So if you have an extreme heat wave, cities may be more likely to do something right after. And then kind of after that window closes, you may have a lack of interest from the public again. So And then another thing that I'm looking at just generally is the two different approaches. And so it's kind of a spectrum where on the left-hand side, you have the dedicated approach, where you would have planners looking at urban heat as the main objective. And so when a policy emerges in urban planning, this is kind of a historical over the last couple hundred years we've seen this. It tends to come out like with a specific policy, a specific pilot project, and it's a very linear process where you might have like a green infrastructure pilot project you hear about a lot to combat urban heat. And basically that's where you're just planning for urban heat and it's not connected to anything else. And what we're trying to move things like climate change resilience and urban heat planning towards is more of a mainstreamed approach where you integrate urban heat into every day-to-day consideration. So when you do any kind of development approvals, you always look at the site for transportation and economic development and social equity. And so you might have urban heat or climate resilience as one of those considerations. So kind of a spectrum that we're looking at. And another reason that this project is interesting to me is I worked with Ben on CLIMAS's 5-year assessment. And my part was looking at how cities in the Southwest are planning long range for climate and environmental risk. And so we kind of looked at past and current generations of general plans for cities. Those were our 6 case study cities on the right-hand side. So 3 in Arizona and 3 in New Mexico. And then I did about 6 interviews per city with planners of different types. So to kind of see how they perceive climate and environmental risks. And we got a lot of really interesting results, but what's relevant to this project in particular is everyone beforehand was addressing urban flooding. And now they're addressing urban flooding, but realizing the climate connection to it. So the climate change connection and more extreme flooding. Before, again, like the early 2000s, no one was talking about urban heat as a planning consideration. And now they're talking about it, but they're not sure how to address it at all. And so it's kind of an emerging topic that everyone's kind of becoming aware of, but they're not sure how to incorporate it into their policies. So Tucson, Albuquerque, and Yuma specifically are really looking at it. So, and just really quickly, on the left-hand side, urban flooding, on the right-hand side, urban heat. And so you can kind of see urban flooding is currently mainstreamed, urban heat is kind of a dedicated, and basically urban heat is emerging on a lot of things. So best example is we have FEMA mapping that's standardized, and we have municipal planning departments that look at stormwater management, and for urban heat, there's no specialized staffing. So for this project, we're really looking at how to document communities in Arizona and Mexico, how they're using urban heat maps and models, because some of them do have them. We're looking at, after we do that, iteratively working with several pilot communities to examine best practices, challenges, and opportunities in using those maps. And then, of course, expanding our network of community partners. So kind of a quick timeline, we already got started by documenting which communities in Arizona and New Mexico have urban heat maps models, because that's never been done before. So I'm already finding some interesting results on some cities that I wouldn't expect having heat maps to do. And collecting really detailed information on the existing heat maps and models. So who made them, what's included, there's no standard format for them. So how cities are requesting them and who's creating them for them. And doing more extensive policy analysis and interviews in those communities that do have them. And then kind of from that, selecting pilot communities and forming interest groups. And then year 2, looking at some iterative work with the pilot communities to help determine challenges and future opportunities for using heat maps and models to really see what's the standard current of practice, which out of all the planning literature has not been done anywhere yet. So kind of scoping work that I think is really interesting and kind of new to the planning profession. So some potential partners, City of Tucson, Pima County, and Pima Association of Governments have already expressed interest in working with us. We've done a lot of work. I say we, CLIMAS, Greg Garfin, Sarah Lee Roy, and I have done work with Las Cruces, El Paso, and Ciudad Juarez. And then American Planning Association and the Urban Land Institute have expressed interest, as well as the Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities, because they're really interested in urban heat, but again, no one's really looking at the policy kind of innovation aspects of it. So 2 quick examples, and then I'll wrap up, Cam. One is specifically kind of just what we've captured in the first couple weeks of our project is really looking at how the City of Tucson and its heat map are working. Because again, no one's kind of done a comprehensive overview of who's using the heat map and what are its challenges and limitations. So PAG had a heat map created, I'd say like 6 years ago. And they're calling it their Green Infrastructure Prioritization Tool, and you can go to it online. So they use it actually right now as part of a criteria for their conserve to enhance grant awards for green infrastructure. And so kind of, I don't think a lot of people were aware that it's already being used for grant awarding processes. And they use it for consideration in regional transportation planning projects, which roadway corridors to plant more trees around to encourage walkability. So the city of Tucson also uses PAG's map, and they actually used it to identify priority areas for Mayor Rothschild's 10,000 Trees campaign. You see a lot of kind of urban forestry is a common thing for combating urban heat. And they actually, in 2014, they surpassed the 10,000 trees, and they're actually up to like 30,000 trees, I think, right now. But so they kind of identified the hot areas and then also had a social equity overlay map that they looked at to help identify where to plant the trees. I think this is really groundbreaking because it's the first documented case that I've seen anywhere, because it's not documented in literature. But the city of Tucson is actually experimenting using the urban heat map to evaluate rezoning requests. And on those parcels being rezoned, which is what a developer does when they go to a parcel and want to have more development on it than the law currently allows. On those parcels that they're asking to be rezoned, the city of Tucson is often referring back to the heat map and requiring more trees or mitigation for heat. So, and again, that's not documented anywhere else in the literature, so I think that's pretty interesting. And then Pima County wants to use it to help for local action on the Paris Agreement. So they're kind of looking at it from that aspect. And then also, interestingly, the county library system is really interested in using it to help them prioritize which libraries to put green infrastructure at. So it's kind of already has a lot of widespread uses here in Tucson. With that said, they're ready for their second generation of urban heat map. They realized that this is kind of a flawed map. It only uses the temperature at like 10 o'clock in the morning. It was done specifically in 2007, so it's kind of a weird year for tree canopy cover. And so there's a lot of things that they realize are not perfect with the map that they're using. And then another one is the city of Las Cruces. A lot of you were at the presentation a couple months ago then.
Yeah, it was actually.
NASA has a developed program where they kind of worked with ASU and CLIMAS and some other partners to develop a heat map for Las Cruces. And so they're kind of just emerging into this idea of using heat map for planning policy. And so they're using the map to discuss vulnerable populations. They're using it to help prioritize green infrastructure investments on a cool corridor pilot project, which again, you see that a lot in emerging kind of areas. You do a pilot project and then you slowly move towards mainstreaming. And they're using it potentially as a tool to guide future development too. And perhaps you can kind of see on the west side of Las Cruces, it's very cool because of their agriculture. So they're looking at ways that perhaps if they conserve the agricultural lands to help cool the rest of the city. So they're kind of having that discussion now. So again, these are just two examples. A lot of cities up in the Phoenix metro area are using heat maps, but they're not really talking to each other. And so hopefully this project can help kind of document the ways that they're being used and really look at the challenges and opportunities of heat maps and kind of the way forward for a lot of these cities. So again, thank you. And I didn't give Ben a chance to speak, but this kind of ties into a lot of his ongoing projects too on urban heat maps. So I see a lot of connections between this, the climate profiles project that Allison's going to talk about later too. So, okay, any questions?
You talk about heat maps a lot. Is there like a definition for heat maps?
There's also another definition. So you see heat maps, heat models, heat modeling, urban heat island models. So it's absolutely not standard. And so you see a lot of universities creating them, NASA's creating them. You see some cities trying to create them themselves, but there's not really consistent language of even the inputs being used to create the heat maps. And so it's creating a lot of confusion. And I'd say unlike FEMA flood maps, which are very standardized and defined, even though they're absolutely flawed if you actually work with them and everyone recognizes that, I think people recognize the flaws in them and they just kind of go forward. And so heat maps are tricky because in the flood maps, floods create a visible, basically visible threat to property that you can see if it floods like in Houston or the other hurricanes that we've seen, you actually see the damage that it creates and you can kind of plan around that later. And for heat, it's different because a heat event can come and go. People are harmed, ecology is harmed, but the buildings look exactly the same after. So I think it's a different type of mapping than planning is used to.
Almost seems like different aspects of the Because it makes it vulnerable to different kinds of heat, like
Exactly.
seasonal or diurnal or
Daytime, nighttime temperatures.
extremes or allergies.
Yeah, so that's a big question is how specific do you get before it becomes overly complex to actually use in decision making? So
So do people ever overlay like 911 calls for heat illness on those maps? Like how many people?
you see that in research sometimes, or social vulnerability or things like tree canopy, but not, I haven't seen any examples of municipalities being sophisticated enough to use that yet, so.
Which kind of goes to a question, are you collecting any data that you can see an impact as these policies are changing? And specifically, I'm thinking of public health. So as there's more trees, are you collecting usage or like are people getting out more and those kind of things?
Yeah, so not in this study, not in the scope of this one. And I think a lot of that work is being done at ASU for specific like microclimatology and how more trees on a property can reduce the heat and stuff. I think we're just looking at the policy aspects of that and perhaps trying to bring in some of those other research to communities that are asking us very specific questions at this point, because they have a lot of those exact same questions. And since there's not a legal framework to use heat in planning, when they try to do things like require more trees for rezonings, they feel like they need even more evidence that it actually works before they put themselves up at risk for a lawsuit. So if that makes sense.
I feel like this study's setting us up for that,
Yeah, that's
down the road. And I think
just
we have
wondered
partners who are interested, very much like Glenn said, that question.
Yeah.
Mark can get the last question.
Sure.
Do you look at the playoff between planting trees or grass or other things that make things cool and water budgets, and where is the break-even point? So
Absolutely, that's kind of an emerging concept we're calling the tree water heat nexus. And so, so it's actually like something that, like just in the last year, I've heard a lot of communities talk about, and it is the concern that a lot of things that you would do to reduce heat might also use more water. And so it's the trade-offs of what you can actually do with the resources that we have. So yeah, absolutely. And I think again, the communities that we're talking to are asking questions specifically like that. So cool.
This one feels like a tip of an iceberg kind of study.